think
Okay.
it's perfect. I would say happy 2025. Let's start into
Yeah.
another year of Discord frequencies, and we will definitely work on content and more interesting topics to share. And I hope we will break records. This week is difficult. There are like every single room in Basel, I think, is filled with workshops. It will be the same next week.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's why we have competition. But great to have you all here. Give it over to
Yeah.
Lars.
Yeah. Well, I speaking of workshops, I'm the reason for my slightly changed background today is I'm in San Francisco for Rum Hackathon, Rumathon as we call it, um, next week Basel. So there's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of travel coming up. But the reason I'm really excited is that we have a special guest today, um, and that's Ahmed. And Ahmed has been behind one of the well one of the bigger launches of sites powered by edge delivery services last year. In particular, the Experience League um, website launch, relaunch, upgrade, and I I had I had a couple of exchanges, not to say headbutts with Ahmed over Slack internally. So I'm I'm really glad to have that he agreed to join us here, and be put on the hot seat, and obviously I'm really excited to learn a bit more about how Experience League was built, some of the thinking that went into it, and your experiences with Edge delivery services. So welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So before we start, can you tell us a bit about yourself? What's your role at Adobe, and how did you come to work with Edge delivery services?
Sure. So this was a bit of an interesting story. I started my career actually as an AEM developer, and I've been an AEM developer for close to 7, 8 years. And this is
Hmm.
from the days of 6.1 all the way to cloud service. I joined Adobe, I think almost 3 years ago now. And I was in the consulting or working on with ACS Consulting
Right.
as an architect, and I was working with various different clients on AEM implementations of different sizes and different purposes. Um, the largest project that I worked on with uh, consulting was actually moving Experience League from the homegrown CMS that they've had before, migrating to Edge Delivery, is to migrate them to Edge Delivery,
Hmm.
which came with a lot of challenges. It came with a lot of interesting things because there are a lot of homegrown things, different content sources, very tight timeline to deliver for Summit. And then, as part of that process of working on consulting, I've transitioned roles from consulting to be a core engineering member of the Experience League team. So I'm currently a principal engineer on the Experience League.
Okay,
I hope
excellent.
to give you an overview.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about the ancient history of Experience League. You said it was a homegrown system. Um, and
So
what? Yeah.
I'll tell
Go
you what
ahead.
I know. I'll tell you what I
Yeah.
know. And what I know is Experience League has gone through a lot of changes and a lot of ups and downs. The goal, for those who don't know, is it's basically documentation for Experience Cloud. That's the major purpose, but it really serves as a sort of the post sales website for any troubleshooting, documentation, other resources that our clients find helpful for Experience Cloud products. Um, and it was initially built with a couple of developers as sort of a proof of concept, or a really quick website to get documentation up, if you will.
Hmm.
It had gone from Experience Manager, actually, to eventually landing on, before moving to Edge Delivery, this homegrown system that takes content from Markdown sources or GitHub repositories where the Markdown resides. And it runs a very, it runs a sort of a bulk process to generate the HTML for all of these
Hmm.
Markdown based on templates, and put all of
Yeah.
that into an Nginx server on a cluster, to serve to the world. And that's
Right.
basically how
So
it works. So everything, including the header, the footer, all of the components, everything was generated all at once in a
so it's
major build and run and put onto Nginx.
it's essentially a static site generator, right? That
Basically,
yeah.
basically, except that it was all homegrown. The entirety
Right.
of it was all homegrown.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's the beauty of static site generators, right? You always think, well, how hard could it be to transform one Markdown document into one HTML document? And in fact, it's not very hard.
Yes.
As long as you don't strive to support all of Markdown, and then you go to here, well, let's do, if we can do one, we can do 10.
Yes.
And suddenly you're in the world where you think, oh well, if we can do 10, we can do 10,000.
Yep.
And that's exactly when you discover that there's a bit more to it than yeah.
And honestly, the complexity doesn't really come from the Markdown to HTML conversion. The complexity
Right.
comes with everything else that you want a CMS to do. Redirects, references, and how to handle them, what to publish and when to publish it, how long your publishing takes, how long your site generation takes. I mean, for our purposes, we have, and then translation as well, which that's a
Yeah.
whole other internal process that documents go through. But for reference, we have around 30,000 pages, 30,000 documentation pages, or 30,000 Markdown files, if you will,
Yeah.
that go through that whole process and end up in 12 languages, which puts us over the 100,000 page actually served.
Hmm. Right. And I think there's also a good chunk of translation in there. I've stumbled over Experience League articles translated into German, and I'm I when I see that, I always think, well, my English is better than your German, so please give me the English version. But can you tell us a bit about this part of the process?
Sure. So this is an interesting process. So it goes through, again, internally through, I can't remember what the translation system is called. If I remember correctly, it's Glass. But this is an internal thing that Adobe uses for translating pretty much anything. It
Right.
has a connection for AEM. It's basically a translation service that has machine translation as well as actual human translation. And we have a lot of human translators that translate to all of these different wonderful languages that we have. The process itself is a bit interesting. So it starts with contributing to the English Markdown, and from there, there's a process that kicks off that triggers that translation depending on the need for human or machine translation, and it ends up putting that Markdown back into an equivalent language repository. So we have a French repository, we have a German repository, and so on and so forth for every
Right.
single repo that relates to a product or a documentation. Um, and it comes with its own challenges. However, those are, for all intents and purposes, the language ones are just language variants of the English site or the English Markdown. And so they
Right.
don't get touched, and they go through the same process as the other Markdown
Right.
file to get to
Yeah.
the site.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, it's not just plain old GitHub flavored Markdown, but the Markdown is coming with certain extensions and additional wrinkles to it, right?
That's right. That's right. So, and again, this is something that's evolved over, if I remember, 11 years. And so there were a lot of requirements that authors had or wanted to add to the site. So the Markdown flavor kind of evolved from the existing Markdown, from vanilla GitHub Markdown, if you will,
Yeah.
all the way to adding other extensions, and most of which are handled by Markdown extensions, and some
Hmm.
of which are handled by a custom extension that the team had built at some
Right.
point to handle things like, let me think, there are things like notes and automations. There are shaded boxes, there are tabs. We have a bunch of other ones, all of which
Yeah.
are documented, and we have a validation process for the Markdown before it goes live to make sure that it
Yeah.
conforms to some standard, and we make sure
Yeah.
that authors don't. And those rules have evolved essentially from learning over the years. If an
Right.
author finds a way to do something that's unorthodox, then we'll see it and we'll say this doesn't make sense to have. Here's a different way to present your content, and
Hmm.
we'll validation behind it so that it doesn't happen again.
Right.
That is not to say that the Markdown source is completely clean. Um, because of the volume that we have, it's really hard to track everything that authors do. And sometimes you'll find HTML in Markdown that's unorthodox or looks a little bit weird, and some of which was
Yeah.
actually migrated as is, just due to timelines again. Um, but yeah, it's a very, just because of the human aspect, the amount of authors we have, the amount of documentation that we have, there's a lot of room for authors to find interesting ways to author their content.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about the kickoff of the project to move this to edge delivery services. What was what was the driving reason for this? Was this just, hey, we are Adobe, let's I really hate the term drink our own champagne. Let's eat a bit more of our own dog food.
Yep.
Or was there some were there struggles that you ran into with the existing system?
Um, well, so yes, there's a lot of that, and that was really the major driver. Is we we've called it Adobe on Adobe, essentially. Is we
Yeah.
have this CMS, if you will. It supports our need, and we could do this migration. It also served as a sort of an encouraging example for clients to say, look, we can serve this many pages from a Markdown source to the web.
Yeah.
The other part of it is Experience League has struggled for the longest time with performance, and that was the biggest
Hmm.
selling point for Edge delivery.
Yeah.
It's if we're able to achieve 100 score on Lighthouse, then I think that we've considered that migration a success.
Right.
Because we were before that we were in on mobile in the single digits, no more than 20, I think. So the performance
Hmm.
was pretty horrible, if you
Yeah.
will. And with the migration, we've improved it to over 90 some to 95, depending on your use case, all
Yeah.
the way to 100 for a lot of pages. It's just that we have some dependencies that um, we had to sort of roll in, which we had no control over, that lowers the performance
Right.
just a little.
Yeah. And of course, I could just look up in the RAM dashboard what your percentage of mobile traffic is, but it makes a much better interview if I ask you, what's your percentage of mobile traffic?
That's an interesting. I don't actually have that number, but I know that it's
Okay.
significantly lower than our desktop.
Right.
Just because
Yeah.
our target demographic are professionals who are usually working out
Right.
of their desk. And so
Okay.
it
Yeah.
barely makes sense for, I mean, we do have some mobile traffic. It's just that there isn't much of it, I
Yeah.
don't believe.
You know what? Let me bring that up right. Um, Let me bring that up right as we talk. Um, and yeah, so it looks like we are getting, what have I done? So we are getting Ooh, this is really fascinating, to be honest. Um, so we get about the mobile share is about 10% of the desktop share. Um, but we get also on top of that about one, right, so comparatively, about 1/3 of the desktop traffic is going to bot traffic. So um, so
Yeah.
there's and actually 90% of that seems to be SEO bots, which is things like, well, just to name one that I know that we are detecting and run
Mm,
is Screaming Frog. So
mhm.
I think we are maybe a bit overcrawling our own site. If if about 25% of our traffic is coming from SEO crawlers. So yeah, but the right, so the for deep technical documentation, for things that are where most of your users are using a desktop app during the workday, um, having that percentage of or having that low percentage of mobile traffic is not at all surprising. So
Agreed. I mean, the other thing is it's a documentation site, and there's a lot of interesting. We've seen a lot of interesting um, teams that have crawled our site without our knowledge. Some of which comes internally
right,
for testing purposes. Some of which, as you mentioned, come from SEO. Some from
yeah,
teams that want to ingest the documentation for AI purposes.
yes,
And so
yeah, yeah, and so just to expand on this sidetrack a bit. Um, in our RAM data, we only see bots that actually execute JavaScript. Right? So most of the most of the let's say lazy bots
right.
aren't executing any JavaScript, so they never send us any RAM data, so I don't see them. But we
Oh yeah.
definitely see them at the CDN level, right? And they can make up, especially for documentation sites, they can make up a large part of the traffic, and the rise of AI crawlers has only increased this, right? And a lot of these crawlers don't have the long engineering tradition of search engine crawlers.
Mm,
And they do things like ignoring your robots.txt, not re- basically they don't pay a lot of attention to being
mm,
polite crawlers, but just try to pull down whatever they can get into their fingers, which can be a bit annoying when you're operating a site like this. And it's something where having good caching at the CDN level is obviously helping, right? Because in that case, it's somebody else's problem. It's Akamai's or Fastly's or Cloudflare's problem. So
yes. And interestingly, we've run through a whole thing with caching. I think you're probably aware of our caching woes that we've had when we first migrated. We were on Azure Front Door,
I'm
which
very aware.
no, which had um,
Yeah,
no push validation integration with Edge Delivery, and so
right,
we've worked hard to get to a point
yeah,
where finally Q4 of last year, so like maybe like 3 months ago, we've migrated
right.
to Akamai completely,
Yes,
and enabled push invalidation, was reduced. I think if I remember correctly, it was like 90% of the load on Origin or on
yep,
the Helix infrastructure. So that was a
right.
big um,
Yes, and I'm so the nice thing about this is that this is um just just a couple of friends talking. Nobody is doing a recording. Correct, Dominik. So I can speak my mind here. I've been publishing a page on the aem-live documentation about unsupported integrations. Right, and this is and I can't name names in that documentation, but can absolutely name names here, right? So Azure Front Door is one of these problematic integrations, and the reasons for this is that a lot of these cloud providers, in particular, Microsoft and Amazon, come with, let's say, a CDN for people who don't really know what a CDN is.
Mhm.
And CloudFront is a bit better in that regard than Azure Front Door.
Right.
But with Azure Front Door, right, we've been dealing with problems like on on the one hand, not being able to properly invalidate caches, right, which means all of the TTLs that we deliver to the CDN are essentially saying come back after 5 minutes. And if you have 30,000 pages or 100,000 pages, and then you know how many of them expire after 5 minutes, which means constant and needless load on the backend, which we don't really like to see. But there are other problems that we've run into with Azure Front Door, including things like that it apparently has problems with domain fronting and using TLS properly, right? Where you would think, oh my God, this can't be possible, right? That you have a system that isn't capable of handling the basics of the secure web these days. But to our surprise, these systems exist. These systems are sometimes deployed within our customers.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're deployed within Adobe. And getting 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 off these systems takes a bit of convincing, a bit of shoving, um, and a lot of hard work. So I'm really glad that you made the call to move from a, let's call it, marginal CDN to a proper CDN,
Yep.
which gives you better performance, gives you better publishing experience, and makes the whole thing much much better to support. And I can proudly say that we didn't have an escalation of CSO caused by experience leak since then. So let's hope it keeps this way,
Yeah.
and let's make sure that somebody else becomes the most interesting edge delivery customer. Um,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah, that was
yeah,
a bit of an interesting one, and there are a number of reasons for it. I mean, it's the existing architecture, and honestly, some of the lack of knowledge on our part in terms of those issues with. Uh, I mean, we've assumed that when Azure promises a CDN and it promises TTL and it promises feature X, Y, and Z, that we will get those. And
yeah,
to our surprise, a lot of that was not true. We've had
yeah,
several CSOs with Azure when we were on Azure to fix some issues that seemingly a CMS would be able, or sorry, a CDN would be able to handle. And that, to our surprise, that was not the case. Things like cache
yeah,
invalidation that you mentioned, and domain fronting, but others
yeah,
as well,
yeah.
especially when it came to their what they call edge rules or whatever that was called.
Great. Okay. So let's talk about the current architecture
Sure.
for experience leak on edge delivery services. So from what I understand, um, is you still have Markdown hosted in GitHub for
Yep.
the majority of technical articles, right? Because your authors like Markdown.
Right.
They like being able to use version control, and all of that makes a lot of sense, especially when you have highly technical authors, right? On the other hand, you also have essentially marketing pages, right? That
Mhm.
are I don't want to call them light on content,
Yep.
but let's say they're heavy on style,
Yep.
and 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 these are, as far as I understand, how do you author them?
These are authored Universal Editor in
Okay,
aem-live.
okay. So you've got Universal Editor, and basically Crosswalk. and you've got Markdown. How do you put that together?
So the AEM and Crosswalk is essentially a whole package that comes together, and what comes out of AEM is semantic markup. Well, let me kind of back up. So we, for our purposes, we use bring your own markup, which
Right.
is different than your traditional edge delivery customer whose content lives on Word documents, essentially, for lack of a
Yep.
better, regardless of provider.
Yep.
And basically, with bring your own markup, you can provide the HTML to edge delivery or the Helix services, and that
Right.
HTML needs to follow a certain structure that we essentially, and basically what happens for AEM with Crosswalk, AEM would deliver that semantic markup directly out of the box, because the blocks or components that we use on in Universal Editor do follow that markup. And
Right.
so we need not do any transformation. We just serve those exactly as they come from out of AEM to the edge delivery infrastructure, and from there it goes through that process, and delivery is easy. For specifically for Markdown content, so that content needs to be transformed. So we have it in Markdown, we have to transform it to HTML. And on top of transforming it to HTML, we have to also conform it to the markup that that edge delivery expects. And that
Mm-hmm.
process happens inside of an Adobe I/O action, essentially.
Okay.
And that's that Adobe I/O action is the point of entry, or the mount point, if you will, for
Right.
our site. And so all
Right.
of the requests that come from edge delivery go through to that, what we call the converter. It's a really not a great name now.
Yes.
But essentially, it's essentially the mount point. It's the entry point, and where all of these requests get routed. So certain paths go to AEM because they're served from AEM, and that's where the marketing pages are. Other paths go to, or are handled within the converter, and their content is obtained using our internal Experience League API. And
Mm-hmm.
that API is what gives us the markdown to transform it. So I'll give you an example. If we go and publish a documentation page, like the /docs/analytics, for example, it will go through the converter. The converter will determine this is a markdown content because it comes from, it's prefixed with docs. And from there, we make a request to our API, and we get the markdown content for that path.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, transform it, conform it to edge delivery HTML, and serve it back.
Yep.
For more context on the API, that one is a bit of an interesting one, and it's going through a redesign and a re-architecture in this quarter and the next quarter. It's a homegrown process that takes all of the markdown from all of these repositories on change. It'll run the process. It'll extract the markdown out of these files and the metadata and other things, and it will put those into a MongoDB with essentially a path identifier for each document, and that is
Mm-hmm.
exposed to the API so that we can get the article that we want when a publish for a specific path happens.
Okay.
And again, all of that flows through the Adobe I/O action.
Okay. And is that MongoDB storage in the middle something to deal with GitHub rate limits or GitHub availability? What was the driving force for introducing it?
That was actually part of the initial implementation.
Okay.
The initial implementation, probably 8 years ago or something,
Right.
there was a point to deliver Experience League content as an API for other purposes. I believe there were some needs to consume that content in a different format through an API.
Yeah.
And that's why, and we've basically continued to use that to this day. Now, it's going through a bit of an architecture in, like I said, in this quarter and the next quarter to change things around a little bit because the applications that currently do that work of putting things into Mongo, and this is not just for documentation or doc content. There are other content types that we support that live in
Yeah.
Markdown. And we need to unify that process and make it a little bit faster and
Yeah.
move away from what essentially happens today is we have a stateful applications that will clone the repository or will get the repository as a tarball and untar it and do the work on the entire repository and push everything that's changed. And we need to change that to move to using the GitHub API essentially for getting
Right.
that content transformed to make it faster,
Yeah.
but also to run that process on individual Markdown files.
Yeah.
Streamlining the process and reducing our application overhead in the process. So
Yeah. Well, and you said that architecture was built 8 years ago, and I think if 8 years ago you suggested a software architecture without MongoDB in there, they would have come and taken away your software architecture card. So
I wouldn't
yeah.
know because I wasn't familiar with MongoDB. So, but
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to work very well. It performs very well. It's
Yeah.
just that our middle layer application or multiple
Right.
applications that do this work today
Yeah.
are just due for an overhaul. It's been
Yeah.
8-10 years. They need a
Right.
refresh.
Yeah.
And the plan is
And
actually to do this serverless on Adobe I/O. So all of that
right.
with the conjunction of a GitHub app, essentially, so that
Right.
we can do this by means of including or inviting the GitHub app to a repository and consuming all of the events that
Yeah.
come out of a repository, regardless of those events, processing them on Adobe I/O, serverless, and populating Mongo, among other
Right.
things like validation
Yeah.
and Markdown to HTML conversion, which we would like to do ahead of time instead of having to
Yeah.
do it just in time like we do today.
Yeah. Makes sense. And I think this approach of pulling the tarball for the entire repository, right, is again an example of these things that are deceptively simple when you start
Yeah.
out with them, and then you suddenly get really big repositories, right? And it's the worst when you have a really big repository that doesn't change, or where most of the files don't change very often, right? Simply due to the fact that in most cases you have a relatively constant rate of change, but all of your accumulated content still needs to be processed every single time, and that can lead to a lot of wasted CPU cycles.
Agreed.
So
And
yeah,
honestly, at the end of the day, the question becomes how much content can authors really change in GitHub in a given day?
yes,
And
exactly.
the
Yeah,
answer is not a whole lot. Not a whole lot.
yeah, yes, yeah, and I. I saw this discussion in the Discord chat today. Somebody says Adobe hates to hear that, but Edge Delivery Services is um, is just a static site generator. And whoever wrote that actually said EDS. So the thing that Adobe actually hates is people abusing our brand. And um, but right, but the thing about static site generators is that that it walks like a duck and it swims like a duck, but it doesn't quack like a duck, right? So it has certain similarities with the static site generators, which often leads people to jump to the conclusion that, oh yeah, well, there's Markdown inside,
Mhm.
and it's somehow using Node.js. It must be a static site generator, right? And then you forget things like, well, actually, it doesn't need to reprocess all of your files every
Right.
time you have a change. But it's fully incremental, and that's a really really important thing because that means just the operational, right? So there's that brings a lot of simplicity with it, and this simplicity has benefits for us as an operations team, which is this doesn't break down as much and doesn't cost as much to run. And it has a lot of advantages for you as a consumer, which is this thing is available most of the time.
Right.
And you don't have to fear that publishing a change is going to bring down your entire website, or is going to get your entire publishing process stuck. So
Yes, and
um,
we've seen a lot of examples of that actually
yeah,
in our case. I mean, when the underlying implementation for our converter, if you will, changes,
yeah,
uh, sometimes we introduce bugs, and when that happens, not everything breaks. Only the pages that were recently
yeah,
published, and we notice those pages, and we
right,
go and fix it before any
yeah,
of the other pages get published, and the site is still
yeah,
available. It's just that we have one or two pages that are broken
yeah,
because of that change.
yeah.
The other thing is the speed at which, I mean, if we're really talking about the other thing with edge delivery that's has really changed things for the Experience League team in particular, is the speed at which we are able to make changes, especially to the front end. Um,
Hmm.
where business used, I mean, it used to take a significant amount of time to make any front end changes to the previous architecture, just because, again, that involves the internal process by which we convert Markdown to HTML. It also impacts how our CSS and JavaScript is built and bundled, and there's a lot of other considerations that the team had to do, which significantly slowed delivering changes. But today we're able to make changes immediately, and that
Hmm.
has really impressed business to the point where we are getting an extreme amount of requests to make changes because, well, it's easy. You
Perfect.
uh,
Exactly. Yeah,
so,
yeah. So one thing I noticed, and right, this is my recollection from the CSOs that we had together,
mm,
um, is that you at some point last year you still had a process where you would basically republish every single page, I think, over the weekend,
yep,
which we very much appreciated when it broke down. So
yep,
that's really one of these things of the heritage of a static site generator. Right? So
yes,
how did
yes.
you where are you in this department, and what did change?
So um, we still run into those issues where we have to bulk publish a large amount of pages, but it's not the entire site. So
Right,
we've removed the need to do a full site republish over the weekend, which is a remnant
right.
from the old system. And currently, I mean, the same process exists. It's just that we do it a little more intelligently. I didn't work
Hmm.
on this personally. A different member of the team did, and he'd essentially made it so that we no longer have to republish the whole thing. Even if the
Right.
entire internal generation needs to be happen, we don't have to publish the entirety of the repo, only the files that have
Yeah.
changed. But we do still
Right.
maintain internal process for bulk publishing if the need arises. An example of this is if we have an issue in the conversion where some specific product is experiencing an issue with some content not really translating well from Markdown to HTML, then we have no choice but to publish those pages.
Hmm.
Same with exposing some metadata on pages that were previously missing for one purpose or another, that we have no choice but to republish those pages, and so
Right.
we go and kick off that process manually as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like I said,
And
we're moving away from that to a much better, much lenient
yeah.
uh, system
Yeah.
that really just tracks changes over time and publishes
Right.
only those changes that were affected.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that is right. When you when you have content changes that affect massive parts of the site, that's a completely different thing
Mhm.
than saying, "Oh, I'm just going to publish everything just in case," right?
Yes.
And that is still something that we see, right? Where we are always looking for sites where there are a lot of content publications that actually don't change anything,
Mm.
right? Because that indicates that there's some problem, some problem downstream, and we try to address this with our customers as we see it in our monitoring and as it's coming up. So and that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that we also work with customers on edge delivery services, right? That this is a two-way conversation, and that sometimes you can get a call from the ops team and saying, "Hey, maybe it's time for you to revise or rethink your architecture a bit."
Right. Right.
Yeah. So you and sorry for the other sidetrack. Ina, I'm really confused by the discrepancy of your background and your foreground, because your background looks like a car and your foreground looks like a cat. Can you tell me what's going on here?
But every good YouTube recording needs a cat, huh? So this is why the
Yeah,
cat is there.
exactly. Yes. Yes.
The background is my usual background, which now works also in Discord. So I
Oh, okay. Okay.
usual background because I love my car.
Okay. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. No. No. So I was thinking, is she really sitting in a car? And you're right. So you are wearing slightly warmer outer clothes. So I thought it was possible that this was an actual car and that you had a cat sitting in your car. And so, okay, okay. I'm relieved for your safety. That looks like a really nice and well behaved and fluffy cat. So, um, great. Ahmed, you said earlier, if we can achieve a lighthouse score of 100, then I would consider this a success. So, would you consider the implementation of edge delivery as a success?
For our purposes,
Yeah.
and for the so the initial implementation leaves a lot to be desired, as is the case with a lot of implementations. But for me personally, the way I feel about it is that yes, it does leave a little bit to be desired, um, because and the reason for that really boils down to our timeline. We had to go live at a certain date, and that
Hmm.
certain date was not movable, and it just had to happen. And so we've made some compromises, and we've essentially elected to keep the backend systems that generate the markdown and that does the publishing, as they are, um,
Yeah.
which has the benefit of we know what to expect, at least out of these backend systems, but also um, carries forward the tech debt from those backend systems. And we are fortunately in a position this year to make all of these changes. So that was another an interesting, I believe, like, for the goals that were set for the migration and the go live date that we've had. I believe that was a huge success for us.
Hmm.
We're able to deliver all of our pages significantly faster. Our SEO is much better, based on our in-house SEO experts. Customers are able to find what they want very quickly. We're able to change things very quickly.
Yeah.
We're able to really make development changes or fix things in production significantly faster than we did before, um, with everything sort of being a little bit decoupled between the converter and the way edge delivery works on the front end with blocks. We're able to make changes very quickly when things break.
Yeah.
And so nothing really stays in our queue in terms of an issue for a very long time.
Right.
And on top of that, we're able to involve external teams to do some of that building for us. I mean, we currently
Hmm.
have a large team of ACS consultants that are doing majority of the work on the marketing side of things, or the marketing pages,
Yeah.
or AEM, and they're able to deliver very quickly the changes that the business needs. Sometimes, admittedly, a little too quickly, because you'd see some things and you find out after the fact, and you're like, well, it is what it is now. But
Yeah.
still. still the benefit exists, and still the ability to refactor and change things after effect still exists, and
Yeah.
it doesn't use a significant overhead. So all that said, I believe, yes, it was a success
Yeah.
relative to our goals.
Yeah. And I can definitely attest to the power of your SEO. Right. So most of you know that you can find the Edge delivery services documentation both on aem-live and um, with the slight delay due to crawling, also on Experience League. But search engines are consistently ranking Experience League higher than aem-live, and I would be lying if I said um, this doesn't annoy me a bit, because it does, because I know that we are faster, we have the content, the content is fresher, there's less distraction. So I feel that aem-live should be number one, but
I,
as
you know,
always, my feelings are irrelevant in this case, and it's Google who decides. And
right. I
so
would agree
yeah,
with you, honestly. I mean, I think I would agree with you, but I don't know where that conversation has gone, but I know that we are moving to a world where those two content sets will reconcile somehow, somewhere. I'm
yeah,
not sure. Uh, Out of my hand at this point,
yeah,
but I'm hoping to see a single content source for that
right,
documentation, whether on Experience
yeah,
League or
yeah,
AI. It makes no
yeah,
difference to me.
yeah,
But yes, I would love
yeah,
to see it in a single
yeah,
source.
yeah. And right, and the thing with being a CMS and having to do documentation is that it's always right in the smaller scale of our team. It's also a fantastic dog fooding. It's a fantastic dog fooding exercise, right? Because we have a particular standard of how we want documentation to be written, and how we want documentation to be served. And that's much easier to do when you're dealing with, hey, come on, we don't even have 100 pages
Right.
of documentation on aem-live, right? So making changes there is much easier and much faster than on Experience League. And on the other hand, we hope that this is sometimes something that can inspire you, right? That where you can say, well, it's working well enough for aem-live. Maybe we can copy that, or maybe we can, and that in a lot of cases is even more important. Maybe we can leave that out because that other place can just can get along without that feature just fine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree. I think we're we're trying. We're trying to make a lot of
yeah,
these changes to make our content appear faster and really help our authors as much as we can. We
right.
still have a lot of issues internally in terms of this has nothing to do with edge delivery, really. It's just an internal process thing of content
Yeah,
not published where it needs to be, of issues with Mongo, which translate to issues with the APIs, and eventually translates to issue with content on edge
yeah,
delivery. um, but the good thing out of all of this is that edge delivery has been constant for us for the most part. I mean, we've seen some issues and some really interesting odd behaviors that the team had addressed very quickly. But outside of that, we're trying to significantly improve that internal
yeah,
process, and
yeah,
hopefully in the process, this is a personal goal of mine, to come to an architecture that maybe clients or whoever is using edge delivery and has a lot of markdown content could use some of what we've
right.
built to run their own.
Yes,
Um, I mean, at least that's our goal. My goal is to get somewhere where anybody would be happy with, and not
yeah,
just something that's very specific to our purposes, although a lot of
yes,
the driving forces is for our purposes.
yeah. So I have two more topics, and I hope we can squeeze them in. One is performance. Right, and I'm looking at your I'm that's a good thing that Dominik is now running the recordings, because I can now do a bit of sneaky multitasking behind the scenes. So I've been glancing at your RUM data, and I see that you still have a bit of work to do when it comes to LCP.
Yep.
And the thing that is surprising is, right, we've been talking about the significant chunk of bot traffic that you get. All of these bots get a green LCP, whereas visitors on Windows get a needs improvement LCP. So
On
my
which
and my guess is that a lot of these SEO bots run with content blockers, ad blockers enabled. So there's a good chance that the that the MarTag that you put on the pages is impacting your LCP. So that would be one thing to look at. The other thing to look at is I'm noticing that you have a 1 second time to first byte across the site. And that also seems right. It doesn't seem super terrible, but I think um, looking at your Akamai configuration could get you another 200 milliseconds on average out there, right? And the things that we've seen with other customers that is causing this is typically bot protection, which can be a relatively costly process in terms of wall time. So and I know this conversation is it's never fun to have that conversation, because you need to pit the user experience team against the security team. Um, but once you convince them and say, well, you know what, the only backend that we have to protect is the edge delivery services backend, and these and this team knows what is coming in and how to turn it off. That can give you another 200 millisecond win in that department.
I'm taking notes now to see if that's something I can talk to the Akamai team. I believe that
Yep.
in terms of configuration, our Akamai configuration is standard with or in alignment, I believe. And that's what
Yes.
the CS team in alignment with the rest of Adobe's properties that are on Edge Delivery. That's business
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
block.
Yes, I can tell you that the blog has a different configuration from the rest, and it's a bit faster. So these 200 milliseconds are exactly the difference that we see between blog.adobe.com and business.adobe.com. And we haven't we haven't gotten to the Akamai team enough to drill down to the exact thing that is impacting it, but we're pretty sure, right? It's the same domain, it's the same backend. There must be one configuration change that is amounting to 200 to 200 milliseconds in time to first byte.
That is actually really good to know. I mean, I can have a conversation with the VPS team and see what's different between ours
Yeah.
and block. I
Okay.
don't know what the
Yeah.
specific configuration is, but
Yeah.
if it's something
Cool.
that we can Google and drive for, yeah, I
Good.
think that would
Good.
be an easy win.
So yeah. So my last question for you would be, um, what is if you if you could talk to yourself 2 years ago, what would you tell your former self about edge delivery services before you'd embarked on that journey?
Um, Interesting. So this is you're basically talking if I had to just see it in practice and see a demo and haven't really worked on an actual
Exactly.
project.
Right. Yeah.
That's I mean, my first impression would actually align with everything that you've seen. So I'd think, well, this is a static site generator, and I would think, how could you, how dare you serve all this complex content out of Word documents? I mean, that's audacious, first of all, and second of all, the entire sort of shift from a front end perspective to uh, essentially standard browser APIs uh, is also pretty audacious in this like vast ecosystem of JavaScript tooling. And you're basically saying we don't need all that. That's just
Mhm.
that's not necessary. It's complicated. It adds to the whole problem of uh, page speed.
Yeah.
Um, and I would have said this is probably not going to make it. And that would be my formal self. And this is a really honest, candid conversation. This
Yeah.
would be, I would say, this is probably not going to make it. This would
Yeah.
require a significant amount of work in addition to the significant sort of work to change the mindset of anybody who's adopting this.
Yes.
Although the result speaks differently, right? Because
Mhm.
you can in fact easily get a really high score just by building your site in this sort of simple manner, if you will.
Yeah.
And that truly browser APIs have come a long ways in terms of
Yes.
standard and the CSS spec as well, in terms of standards and in terms of utility.
Yes.
Um, so that would be honestly, I mean, that was honestly how I felt initially. I was like, there's
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
challenging. This would be really
Yeah.
hard. It's very specifically, especially because I work at Adobe and I was an AEM consultant for a very long time, and I was just having a very hard time of understanding how could you convince anybody to switch from Experience Manager to
Yeah.
this, because there are two
Yes.
different things. And the unfortunate thing is that we've called it Experience Manager, and so it convoluted a lot of things for a lot of our clients and a lot of users. Oh, this is like the next version of AM. Well, it isn't, because it just isn't. Like, it's a whole different stack of architecture.
Yeah.
um but yeah, I would feel very skeptical. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna lie, and which is how I felt. But now that we're in it, and now that I really understand the ease of use part of it and the ease of development part of it, it it makes me, I mean, it makes me less skeptical. It makes me more confident that this will actually make it. And it's going to be interesting to see what other improvements that we get and other features that get built onto the system. So I'm very looking forward to everything else that comes after this, right? So
Yeah.
there's the work with the marketing tools that need to happen in terms of targeting and A/B testing, which I've seen some of the work done there, and the bringing more features to the authoring experience. I mean, for Experience League, we don't really have that, except it comes with, or sorry, we don't use Word documents, and we don't use the Sidekick.
Yeah.
It's either in Markdown or it's in AEM with uh,
Universal editor.
Versa Editor. Yes,
Yeah.
and a lot of the features that come there. But I'm really curious to see what happens with the doc-based authoring and the Sidekick and
Yeah.
all the features that it might add.
Okay. So, Ahmed, thank you so much for all your time, for your insights, for your patience, staying with us, and right end. And Edge delivery services, as you said, is a seeing is believing product. So
Absolutely.
I'm I'm really glad that you shared your journey with us. And and that leaves me really just with one more question to Dominic. When when are we going to meet again, and what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, we will meet again in 2 and in 4 weeks. And in 2 weeks,
Okay.
there will be a special session from Lars about his latest blog post. So we speak about when simple architecture beats complex frameworks. So let's see, maybe we can also invite some people to talk.
Yes.
And in 4 weeks, we talk about calendar. So we have some effective calendar implementation and edge delivery services. So let's see with our
Yeah.
guest there. I think it will be super interesting, and I hope to see a lot of people there. Even the ones that are
Yeah.
now looking at the recording, they should join in 2 and in 4 weeks. Please.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. Bye bye.
Okay.
Thanks,
See
team.
you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Thanks,
Thank
bye.
you.